In the lush green valley of Swat, surrounded by snow-capped mountains and flowing rivers, there once lived a young girl who found pure joy in the rhythm of learning. Her name was Malala, and from the earliest days of her childhood, her greatest delight was in holding a book and tracing her fingers over the neat, printed words that promised endless worlds of discovery. Her father, Giauddin Yousafzai, was a teacher, an educator with a passionate belief that knowledge was the true light that could drive away the darkness of ignorance. He owned a small school in Mingora, where children both boys and girls came to learn, laugh, and dream. For Malala, the school was not just a place of study. It was a second home filled with the smell of chalk dust, the scratch of pencils on paper, and the echo of laughter bouncing off classroom walls. She would sit on the front bench, her eyes shining with curiosity, her hand always raised first to answer a question. Education, to her, was not merely about grades, it was a promise of freedom, dignity, and strength. The Swat Valley at that time was known as the Switzerland of the East, famous for its natural beauty and peaceful charm. Tourists from across the world came to enjoy its scenery, and the people of Swat were known for their warmth and hospitality. Malala's childhood was filled with ordinary joys, running through orchards, sharing secrets with friends, and coming home to the smell of her mother's cooking. Her home echoed with the sound of books being read aloud, discussions about justice, equality, and education. Her father often told her that pen and paper were her strongest weapons, and she believed him completely. She grew up watching him stand firm against narrow-minded ideas, his voice steady even when others urged silence. He treated Malala not as a child to be protected from the world's harshness, but as a person who could change it someday. But the peace that once defined Swat began to shatter slowly. Rumors spread of strange men appearing in villages, men with long beards and stern faces who carried guns and preached a twisted version of faith. They called themselves the Taliban, and their messages grew louder every day through illegal radio stations, through fear, through threats whispered in the marketplace. At first, people thought they would leave, that this storm would pass. But the voices of intolerance grew stronger, their demands crueler. They began to declare that girls should not go to school, that women should stay confined within their homes, that education was a sin for females. One by one, schools were burned, teachers threatened, and families silenced. Malala was only a child, but she understood the danger that surrounded her. Each morning, when she tied her scarf and packed her school bag, she knew she was defying someone's order, challenging someone's fear. Yet she refused to stop. The thought of staying home, of being cut off from her books and her classmates, felt like suffocation. She could not understand how learning something so pure, so full of light, could ever be forbidden. Her father continued to run his school, though the threats against him grew by the day. Sometimes, he would come home looking worried, his voice quieter than usual, but when he looked at Malala, determination returned to his eyes. He had raised her to be fearless, and now her courage strengthened his own. The streets of Mingora changed, the once busy markets became places of whispers and glances. Music was banned, laughter frowned upon, and girls began to disappear from classrooms. Still, Malala kept going. Every day, she and her friends would hide their books under their shawls, walking quickly to avoid drawing attention. She began writing in secret, keeping a diary for BBC Urdu under a pseudonym, describing what it was like to live under the Taliban's shadow. In her diary, she poured her fears and hopes, how she wished to become a doctor, how she longed to return to normal life, how painful it was to see her friends forced out of school. Her words, though written anonymously, carried the voice of thousands of silenced girls. As the Taliban's control deepened, gunfire became more frequent, explosions more common, and the sound of birds in the morning was often replaced by the hum of helicopters overhead. Many families fled Swat in fear, seeking refuge in other cities. But Malala's family chose to stay, believing that running away meant surrendering their right to live freely in their own land. At night, Malala would lie awake, listening to distant gunshots, clutching her books close to her chest as if they could protect her. The fear was constant, like a shadow that never lifted, but so was her faith. She prayed not only for safety but for strength to keep learning, to keep believing in the power of knowledge. In those years, when darkness fell over Swat, the sight of a girl walking to school became an act of defiance. Malala, though barely in her teens, became a quiet symbol of resistance. Her voice, steady, pure, and full of conviction, began to echo beyond her valley. She spoke in interviews, urging the world to notice what was happening in her homeland. Her courage stood in stark contrast to the fear that ruled her surroundings. While others hid, she stood taller. While others whispered, she spoke aloud. The classroom that once felt like an ordinary place of learning had become a battleground between ignorance and enlightenment, and Malala refused to give up her place in it. The year was turning darker in Swat Valley, and what had once been a place of laughter, learning, and song began to echo with the sound of fear. The Taliban's presence, once a rumor whispered in corners, became a reality that spread like a shadow over the valley's green hills. They came with guns slung across their shoulders and words that carried the weight of violence. They claimed to bring justice, but their justice was built on silence, control, and terror. They set up illegal FM radio stations that everyone called Mullah FM, where fiery voices declared what was allowed and what was forbidden. Each night, people sat by dim lights, listening as those voices announced new bans: no music, no television, no laughter in the streets, and, worst of all, no education for girls. The familiar sounds of school bells ringing in the morning faded into absence, replaced by the thud of boots and the chilling echo of explosions that marked yet another school reduced to ashes. One by one, the Taliban began to target schools across the valley, calling them symbols of Western corruption. The once bright, cheerful walls where children scribbled letters and solved math problems were turned into rubble and smoke. Blackboards were shattered, desks burned, and books scattered like fallen birds across the ground. Malala, still a young girl, watched in horror as the world she loved so dearly, the world of learning, of open minds and questions, began to crumble around her. Teachers disappeared, some fleeing for safety, others silenced forever. Parents, terrified for their children, began to keep their daughters home, whispering that it was no longer safe. The roads that once filled with chatter and the sound of footsteps on the way to school grew empty. It was as if the valley itself had lost its heartbeat. The Taliban did not only destroy buildings, they sought to break spirits. They patrolled streets, issuing threats to families who disobeyed their decrees. Flyers were posted warning that any girl caught attending school would face grave punishment. Those who dared to speak out were labeled enemies of Islam, traitors, or agents of the West. The fear seeped into homes, into conversations, into the quiet corners of daily life. Mothers who once braided their daughters' hair for school now combed it in silence, unsure if letting them step outside would bring harm. Fathers locked their doors earlier each evening, eyes flickering toward the mountains where armed men moved unseen. The air in Maingora grew heavy, thick with uncertainty. Malala's father, Giauddin, refused to bow to their tyranny. His school, Kushal, remained one of the few places where children still dared to come and learn. He stood before classrooms, speaking about courage and education, though he knew his words could make him a target. His voice, once filled with the calm rhythm of a teacher, now carried a tremor not of fear for himself, but for the children who looked up to him. Malala would watch him leave each morning, his steps steady but his eyes shadowed, and she felt both pride and worry battling inside her. The Taliban's threats grew louder. They accused teachers of spreading immorality, they called the pursuit of knowledge a sin, and their men destroyed anything that represented progress. At night, Malala could hear the distant explosions, the unmistakable sound of another school being blown apart. Each one was like a wound on the land, a place where dreams were buried under bricks and ashes. She began counting them, trying to keep track of how many schools had been lost. It wasn't just buildings being destroyed, it was futures, voices, and the hopes of an entire generation. The Taliban's broadcasts filled her with anger and disbelief. How could anyone fear education? How could they believe that a girl with a book was dangerous? Yet she also understood that these men ruled through fear, and fear was spreading faster than fire. Despite the danger, Malala and a few of her classmates still found ways to learn. They met secretly, their lessons quiet, their laughter restrained. Books were hidden beneath shawls and school bags tucked under beds. When they walked to school, they tried not to attract attention, their hearts pounding at every checkpoint, every strange glance. Sometimes, teachers changed locations to avoid suspicion, and lessons were held in private homes. Each day felt like an act of rebellion, each step toward education a small victory against darkness. Malala's father continued to speak publicly, appearing on television and radio, condemning the destruction of schools. His bravery inspired her but also made her afraid. She knew the Taliban did not forgive those who opposed them. Then came the day when the Taliban issued their most chilling decree: all girls' schools must close by January 15, 2009. The announcement was read aloud on their illegal radio station, a voice of command that silenced the valley. The date hung over everyone like a death sentence. In the days leading up to it, the atmosphere in Maingora grew suffocating. Malala went to school every morning, knowing it might be her last. Her classmates tried to act normal, but their smiles were fragile. Teachers gave extra assignments, as if trying to preserve one last bit of learning before it was stolen from them. On the final day before the deadline, Malala looked around her classroom and tried to memorize every detail: the cracked blackboard, the sunlight slanting across the floor, the scent of chalk, the sound of her friends whispering. She didn't want to believe that something as beautiful as education could be taken away by force. That night, when the last school bells of Swat rang out, an eerie silence followed. The next morning, doors stayed closed, windows shuttered, and the valley seemed to hold its breath. The Taliban had succeeded in making fear the new law. But inside Malala's heart, something began to burn: not anger alone, but a determination too strong to be extinguished. She could feel it in every beat of her heart, every glance at her untouched schoolbooks, every story her father told about the power of words. The fear around her was real, but so was her belief that one day she would walk through those school gates again, that the valley of Swat would hear the laughter of girls once more, that the sound of learning would rise again over the noise of gunfire and silence. When fear had woven itself into every street of Swat Valley, when voices were silenced and even hope seemed like a dangerous thing to hold onto, a young girl found a different kind of weapon: her words. Malala had always believed that education was her birthright, that learning could not be stolen by threats or gunfire. Yet as the Taliban's grip tightened and schools turned into ruins, she began to realize that silence was not just survival, it was surrender. Every day, she watched the world around her grow smaller. Girls who once laughed beside her in classrooms now stayed home behind closed doors. Teachers spoke in whispers. Even her father, though unbroken, looked more tired than before. Malala's heart ached to tell someone, anyone, what was happening in her valley. She wanted the world to see the fear that had crept into their lives, to hear the story of how the simplest dream, a girl's desire to go to school, had become an act of defiance. In late 2008, an opportunity arrived, quietly and unexpectedly. A BBC Urdu reporter was looking for a student from Swat who could write about what it was like to live under the Taliban. The purpose was to give people outside the valley a glimpse into their reality, not through official statements or statistics, but through the eyes of a child. It was dangerous work. Whoever agreed to write would have to do so anonymously. The Taliban were known for hunting down those who spoke against them. Still, when Malala's father mentioned the idea to her, she didn't hesitate. She was only 11, but she felt the weight of 1,000 unheard voices pressing on her shoulders. She wanted to speak not just for herself, but for every girl who had been told she was forbidden to dream. Her father agreed, though worry clouded his expression. They both knew what could happen if anyone found out. To protect her, they decided she would write under a pseudonym: Gul Makai, the name of a character from a famous Pashto folktale about a brave girl who defied the odds. It was fitting, and it gave Malala a small shield behind which she could tell her truth. Late at night, under the faint glow of a lamp, she began to write. Her words were simple but powerful, drawn straight from her heart. She described the fear that had settled over her school, the sound of bombs that punctuated her lessons, the way she and her friends hid their books beneath their clothes so the Taliban wouldn't catch them. She wrote about the dread that came with each new decree, the helplessness of watching her valley slip further into darkness. Yet she also wrote about her dreams, how she still wanted to learn, how she still believed education was the only way to break the chains of ignorance. Each diary entry was sent secretly to the BBC reporter, who published them without revealing her identity. When the first post went up in January 2009, it caught the attention of readers across Pakistan and beyond. People were struck by the honesty and courage in her words. Here was a child, living in a war zone, describing what most adults were too afraid to say. Her diary didn't sound like a political statement, it sounded like a cry for humanity. I may not go to school again, she wrote in one entry, but I will fight for my right to learn until my last breath. Her words spread quietly, but their impact was immense. Malala continued to write even as life in Swat grew more dangerous. The Taliban intensified their patrols, and news of more schools being destroyed came almost daily. Yet every evening, she would sit with her notebook, pouring her thoughts onto paper. Sometimes she wrote about the beauty of her valley, the mountains, the river, the way sunlight touched the rooftops, as if reminding herself that Swat was more than the violence that had claimed it. Other times, she wrote about fear, the sound of boots outside her door, the anxiety that gripped her mother, the nightmares that followed the explosions. Her diary became both her weapon and her refuge. People began to talk about Gul Makai. Her words reached classrooms in distant cities, radio stations, and international newspapers. Even those who didn't know her real name felt a connection to her courage. For the first time, the world was hearing directly from a girl living under Taliban rule, not from journalists or politicians but from someone who experienced it every day. Her diary forced readers to confront the truth that education was not a privilege but a battle being fought in silence. Though she was still hidden behind a false name, Malala began to feel the stirrings of something greater than fear. She started speaking more openly within her community, appearing with her father at local meetings and television interviews, her face uncovered and her voice steady. She no longer just wrote about injustice, she began to challenge it in person. Her diary had given her confidence, and that confidence began to grow into a calling. Yet danger lurked close. The Taliban had started to notice the growing resistance among the people, especially among those who refused to stop sending their daughters to school. Whispers spread about the mysterious Gul Makai, the brave girl who dared to write. Every night before sleeping, Malala would hide her school bag in case soldiers raided their house. She would think about the girls who had already given up their studies, and wonder if one day she would be forced to do the same. Still, she refused to let fear take over. If one man can destroy everything, she often told her father, why can't one girl change it? Her diary became her proof that her voice could reach beyond Swat's mountains, proof that even in the darkest times, words had power. Each new entry carried a piece of her soul, a mixture of pain, hope, and unshaken belief in education. And though she never signed her real name, she felt a quiet pride every time she saw her words shared with the world, because behind the name Gul Makai was a young girl who refused to be silenced, a girl who believed that even the smallest voice, when spoken with truth, could echo louder than the sound of guns. The morning of October 9, 2012, began like any other for Malala Yousafzai. The valley of Swat was slowly returning to life after years of turmoil, though shadows of fear still lingered in every corner. The sun had risen softly over the mountains, and the air carried the crisp scent of autumn. Malala, 15 years old now, woke early to prepare for school. She tied her hair neatly, packed her books into her school bag, and stepped out with her usual determination. The Kushal school was more than just a building for her, it was the heart of her purpose, the place where she still believed dreams could survive even after being buried under fear. Her father, Giauddin, watched her leave that morning, pride and worry crossing his face in equal measure. Though life had started to regain a rhythm, the Taliban's threats against her had grown louder. Her face had been shown on television, her name printed in newspapers, her words quoted around the world. She had become more than a student now, she was a symbol of defiance, and symbols, in times of extremism, were dangerous to those who thrived on silence. After her classes ended that afternoon, Malala gathered her books and joined her friends on the small white school van that took the girls home every day. The chatter was light and full of laughter. The girls discussed homework, exams, and television shows, their giggles filling the air like music. Malala sat by the window, her school bag on her lap, her mind busy thinking about an upcoming test. The van drove along the familiar dusty road lined with tall trees, their leaves trembling in the soft wind. It was a route she had taken hundreds of times, but that day it carried an unseen danger. Unbeknownst to her, 2 armed men were waiting ahead, watching, planning. They had followed the van before, learning her routine, and today they intended to carry out the orders that had come down from their leaders to silence the girl who had dared to speak for education. As the van slowed down near a crowded market to let a few students off, a masked man stepped forward, signaling for the driver to stop. The driver, startled, pressed the brakes. The man peered inside, his face half covered, his eyes sharp and unyielding. "Who is Malala?" he demanded. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence inside the van was thick, frozen with disbelief. Then, almost instinctively, some of the girls turned their eyes toward her. There was no time to scream, no time to think. The gunman raised his weapon and fired 3 bullets. One struck Malala in the left side of her head, another hit her neck, and a third grazed a classmate. The sound of gunfire shattered the quiet afternoon, sending birds scattering into the sky. The gunman fled instantly, disappearing into the chaos of the streets. Inside the van, panic erupted. Blood stained the seat, books fell to the floor, and the cries of frightened girls echoed in the air. Malala's head slumped to the side, her scarf soaked red. The driver, trembling but determined, started the van and sped toward the nearest hospital. The journey felt endless, every second stretched by fear and desperation. News of the attack spread rapidly through Mingora, reaching Malala's family within minutes. Her father rushed to the hospital, his heart pounding, refusing to believe the words he had heard. When he arrived, he saw his daughter lying unconscious, her face pale, a bandage hastily wrapped around her head. Doctors worked frantically, trying to control the bleeding, their hands moving quickly as they prepared her for surgery. The small local hospital was unequipped to handle such severe injuries, and they knew she would need to be moved immediately to a larger facility. A military helicopter was arranged to airlift her to Peshawar, where better medical care awaited. In Peshawar, surgeons operated for hours to remove the bullet that had lodged near her brain. The world outside the operating room held its breath. Her family waited, praying, their minds caught between hope and despair. When the doctors finally emerged, they said she was alive but in critical condition. The bullet had damaged part of her skull, and her chances of survival were uncertain. Yet even in those first fragile hours, something remarkable began to happen. News of the attack spread far beyond Pakistan, reaching every corner of the world. Newspapers, television channels, and social media erupted with outrage. A young girl had been shot for wanting to go to school. It was a story that shook the conscience of humanity. As Malala lay in a coma, thousands of people held vigils for her recovery. Her name became a rallying cry for education and freedom. Governments condemned the attack, and organizations around the world offered help. The Pakistani army decided to fly her to the United Kingdom for advanced treatment once her condition stabilized. On October 15, she was transported in a specially equipped air ambulance to Birmingham, where doctors at Queen Elizabeth Hospital continued her care. Her parents followed later, carrying with them both fear and an unshakable pride. Malala had been attacked because her words carried truth, because her courage had threatened those who thrived on oppression. In the sterile quiet of the hospital room, machines hummed softly beside her bed. Tubes and monitors surrounded her fragile body, but her spirit remained untouched. The bullet that had tried to silence her had instead given her voice a new, unstoppable force. Outside the hospital, strangers gathered to leave messages, flowers, and prayers. In classrooms across the world, children spoke her name, writing her letters of hope. Leaders and activists praised her bravery, and debates began about the right to education in regions still trapped by extremism. But in that moment, for her family, none of that mattered, only the rise and fall of her chest, the faint proof that she was still fighting. In Swat, the school van where the attack took place was cleaned, but the stains of that day remained in memory. The girls who had witnessed it never forgot the flash of the gun, the sound of the shots, the feeling of disbelief that something so cruel could happen to someone so kind. They spoke of Malala's courage, of how she had become their voice. Her father, though crushed by guilt and grief, stood tall before the world's cameras and repeated the same message. His daughter had always believed that education was not a crime, that the pen was stronger than the gun. And somewhere, thousands of miles away, even as her body battled for life, the flame she had lit in Swat burned brighter than ever, refusing to be extinguished by bullets or fear. When Malala Yousafzai opened her eyes for the first time after the attack, she was thousands of miles away from her home in Swat Valley. The sterile white walls, the rhythmic beeping of hospital machines, and the unfamiliar faces around her were nothing like the world she remembered. She was in Birmingham, United Kingdom, at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, a place she had been airlifted to after doctors in Pakistan determined her injuries were too severe to be treated locally. The journey that had brought her there was filled with uncertainty and fear. 4 days, she had been unconscious, hovering between life and death. Her family, still in Pakistan, had spent those agonizing hours praying, their minds unable to imagine a life without her. When the news finally reached them that she was alive and stable, it felt like a miracle. The bullet that entered the side of her head had narrowly missed vital parts of her brain. Doctors said her survival was against all odds. Yet, the girl who had fought for education with her words was now fighting for her life with her will. When Malala regained consciousness, she did not immediately understand what had happened. She tried to speak, but no sound came out. A tracheotomy tube had been placed in her throat to help her breathe. Her head throbbed with pain, her vision was blurry, and she felt as though she had been reborn into another world. The doctors and nurses gently explained where she was and what had occurred, their voices soft and reassuring. Her first instinct was not fear or confusion, but curiosity. She scribbled on a piece of paper, asking, "What happened to me? And then, where is my father?" Even in her weakened state, her thoughts were of her family and her school. Her father, Giauddin, soon arrived in Birmingham with her mother, Torpekai, and her brothers, Kushal and Atal. When they saw her lying there pale but breathing, fragile but alive, they wept with gratitude. The doctors called it a miracle, but her family called it faith. News of Malala's survival had already swept across the world. From Pakistan to America, from Europe to Africa, people prayed for the girl who had dared to speak up when others could not. Her story became a symbol of courage in the face of brutality. Global leaders issued statements condemning the attack, children held candlelight vigils in her name, and social media filled with messages of hope, love, and defiance. The world, it seemed, had found in her story a reflection of its own struggle, the universal fight for equality, freedom, and the right to learn. Letters poured into the hospital by the thousands. Some were from schoolchildren promising to study harder because of her example. Others were from world leaders offering support. Michelle Obama sent a letter from the White House, and even Queen Elizabeth extended an invitation for her to visit. But Malala's recovery was far from easy. She spent weeks in intensive care, undergoing multiple surgeries to repair her skull and restore her hearing, which had been damaged by the gunshot. She faced moments of pain so sharp that it felt like fire running through her head, but she endured each procedure with the same quiet strength that had guided her before. Her doctors often said that it was her determination, her will to live and learn, that made her recovery extraordinary. When she began to speak again, her first words were filled with questions about school, about her friends, about SWAT. She wanted to know if the other girls in the van were safe, if her classmates were still studying, if the Taliban had been stopped. Even as her body healed, her heart remained tied to her homeland, to the people she had left behind. In early 2013, after months of recovery and therapy, Malala slowly began to step back into the public eye. The world that had once known her as an anonymous blogger now recognized her face and name. Her voice, though soft, carried a power that no bullet could destroy. Interviews and documentaries began to capture her story not as one of victimhood, but of resilience. She met with political figures, spoke at international conferences, and advocated for the same cause that had once nearly cost her life: education for every child, especially girls. The British government provided her family with safety and a home in Birmingham, but her heart remained with Pakistan. She often said she missed the mountains of Swat, the laughter of her friends, and the feeling of belonging to her valley. Yet she also understood that her platform now reached far beyond its borders. Her courage inspired a global movement. Schools were named after her, awards were given in her honor, and organizations began to use her story to promote education and gender equality. But Malala did not want sympathy or fame, she wanted change. Together with her father, she co-founded the Malala Fund, an organization dedicated to ensuring that every girl in the world had access to 12 years of free, quality education. The fund supported local activists and programs across countries like Nigeria, Kenya, and Afghanistan. Her speeches became rallying calls for justice. At the United Nations, on her 16th birthday, a day now celebrated as Malala Day, she stood before hundreds of world leaders and declared, "They thought that the bullets would silence us, but they failed. Weakness, fear, and hopelessness died. Strength, power, and courage were born." Her voice trembled slightly, but her words rang with conviction. She was no longer just a survivor. She had become a symbol of hope. The support she received from around the globe was unlike anything seen before for a single individual from such humble beginnings. Nobel laureates praised her, and human rights organizations championed her cause. In classrooms from Tokyo to Toronto, students learned about her as part of their curriculum. Yet through all the attention, Malala remained humble. She still loved the small, ordinary things: reading novels, helping her mother cook, teasing her brothers. Fame did not change her essence, it only expanded her mission. She often said she wished she could walk freely in the streets of Niora again, buy sweets from her favorite shop, and sit in her old classroom with her friends. But she also understood that her journey had become larger than her own life. Her survival was not just a personal victory, it was a declaration that ideas, once born, could not be killed by fear or violence. The girl who had been carried unconscious from a school van in Swat was now standing before the world, alive, unbroken, and ready to continue the fight for the right every child deserves: the right to learn. Malala Yousafzai's recovery marked not just the return of her health, but the beginning of a movement that would ripple across the world. The girl who once sat in a small classroom in Swat Valley, dreaming of becoming a doctor, had now become a global advocate for education, her name synonymous with courage and the fight for equality. When she co-founded the Malala Fund in 2013 alongside her father, Ziauddin Yousafzai, her purpose was clear: to give every girl the chance to learn and to ensure that no child would ever have to risk her life for a book or a classroom again. What began as a simple vision born from pain soon transformed into a powerful organization working in some of the world's most marginalized regions, from Pakistan to Nigeria, from Afghanistan to Brazil. The Malala Fund focused on supporting local educators and activists, amplifying their work, and investing in communities where girls were most likely to be denied schooling. Malala often said that she was not speaking for girls, she was speaking with them, and that distinction shaped her entire approach to advocacy. Even as her influence grew, Malala remained deeply rooted in her belief that change must start from within communities. Through the fund's Golmakai network, she helped empower women leaders on the front lines of education reform, giving them resources and global visibility. Her speeches were not filled with anger, but with an unshakable optimism that education could heal divisions and transform societies. She met with presidents, prime ministers, and community leaders, urging them to invest in schools, to rewrite laws, and to see girls' education not as charity, but as a necessity. She traveled to refugee camps, rural villages, and conflict zones, listening to the stories of girls whose struggles mirrored her own. Each visit reminded her of Swat, of the friends she had left behind, of the countless girls whose dreams had been silenced by violence or poverty. Her empathy gave her voice a rare authenticity. She did not speak as an outsider observing injustice, but as someone who had lived it. In 2014, just 2 years after surviving the assassination attempt, Malala received the world's highest honor, the Nobel Peace Prize. At 17, she became the youngest recipient in history. The news reverberated across continents, filling headlines and classrooms alike. When she walked onto the stage in Oslo to accept the award, dressed in a soft pink shawl that once belonged to Benazir Bhutto, she carried with her the hopes of millions. In her speech, she declared that the prize was not hers alone but belonged to every child who had been denied education, to every girl who had raised her voice against oppression, and to every teacher who continued to educate despite fear. Her words were not grandiose, they were sincere, spoken with the same clarity that had defined her since childhood. She stood not as a symbol of pity, but as a living reminder that courage, when guided by purpose, can rewrite the course of history. The Nobel Prize amplified Malala's platform, but it did not alter her humility. Even amid her growing fame, she continued her studies in Birmingham, balancing her academic life with her activism. She attended Edgbaston High School and later went on to study philosophy, politics, and economics at the University of Oxford, walking the same halls that had once educated world leaders. Yet despite the prestige, she often reminded people that her real classroom was the world, that every story she heard from girls in Syria, Kenya, or India taught her more than any textbook could. During interviews, she spoke with gratitude for the opportunities she had received, but she also expressed her deep longing for Pakistan. She missed her home, her friends, the mountains of Swat, and the feeling of belonging to her own land. Her mission was not to leave her country behind, but to change it, to help it grow into a place where every child could learn without fear. The Malala Fund expanded its reach year after year, launching campaigns for digital education, scholarships for young women, and partnerships with governments to reform policies. Malala met with influential figures such as Barack Obama, Justin Trudeau, and Emmanuel Macron, pressing them to allocate more funding toward education. She spoke at the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, and countless international summits, her presence commanding attention not through power, but through sincerity. When the Taliban regained power in Afghanistan in 2021 and girls were once again banned from schools, Malala's voice rose with renewed strength. She condemned the injustice, demanded accountability, and worked with activists inside the country to support underground schools. Her compassion was unwavering, her commitment relentless. Every statement she made carried both sorrow and hope: sorrow for the injustice still alive in the world, and hope for the change that could still come through education. Malala's legacy grew not only through her activism but through her storytelling. Her memoir, I Am Malala, published in 2013, became an international bestseller, translated into dozens of languages. Through its pages, readers saw the life of a girl who had faced darkness but never surrendered to it. The book inspired students, educators, and parents alike, reminding them that one voice, no matter how small, could ignite a global movement. Later, through her production company, Extracurricular, she expanded her advocacy into media, producing films and documentaries that highlighted women's stories and struggles for education. Her work in storytelling became another extension of her belief that visibility itself was a form of empowerment. As the years passed, Malala evolved from a teenage activist into a thoughtful global leader, but she never lost her authenticity. She continued to write, to speak, and to challenge the systems that held girls back. She often reflected on how strange it felt to be celebrated for something that, in her view, should have been ordinary: the right to learn. She insisted that the true heroes were not those who received awards, but those who quietly kept teaching, who continued attending school despite fear, who refused to give up on the promise of education. Her humility disarmed those who met her. Her intelligence inspired them. In every corner of the world, from the crowded streets of Karachi to the classrooms of New York, Malala's name became synonymous with hope. Her story was taught in schools, painted on murals, and echoed in speeches about human rights. She had become more than an individual. She was a movement, a reminder that knowledge is the most powerful force against oppression. Yet for Malala, her journey was far from over. She often said that her mission was not just about education, it was about equality, justice, and the belief that every child, regardless of gender or background, deserved the chance to write their own destiny. And so, with her books in one hand and her voice unshaken, she continued to travel, to speak, to fight, and to dream for a world where no girl would ever have to choose between silence and survival.